Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new, thanks so much for stopping by. I hope you will consider subscribing. So today we're going to do our first canning session of the year. We are going to be canning up some delicious bourbon barbecue sauce. Now I do have a recipe on my channel here for bourbon barbecue sauce, but it is not a canning recipe. And many of you have contacted me and asked me, is this safe for canning? I didn't want to say yes. I was pretty confident that it was, but I didn't want to say yes for sure because it was certainly not a tested recipe. It was just a recipe I came up with that I make on the fly for my family. So I've been doing some research, looking at different recipes, trying to find one that is similar that we could use, and then I could definitely say, yes, it is safe for canning. And I came across one. Actually, it's in one of my favorite canning books, the all-new Ball Book of Canning and Preserving. You guys know I love this book. If you haven't around my channel very much, we've canned a lot of things from it. And oddly enough, the Pawpaw's Bywater barbecue sauce is very similar, has a very similar ingredients to what I use in my bourbon barbecue sauce. So we're going to use that as a guide, but I'm going to make a few safe changes to make it my own. This is a very basic, it has quite a few ingredients in it, but it's a pretty basic recipe. It does have a ketchup base to it, so if you are anti-ketchup, you're probably not going to enjoy this recipe, but I love using ketchup as a base for barbecue sauce. It's just a really nice, it makes for a really nice texture. It's very different than using fresh tomatoes. So I enjoy ketchup-based recipes. If you don't, this is probably not the recipe for you. The ketchup that I use for this recipe and the ketchup that I use all the time is the Heinz, the Simply Heinz. It doesn't have any yucky stuff added to it. It's pretty basic: tomato concentrate, distilled vinegar, cane sugar, salt, onion powder, spice, and natural flavoring. So it's basically an all-natural ketchup. So I feel pretty good about using it, and it has great flavor. In my opinion, there's no other ketchup that is as good as that one. So that is what I am using today. We need 8 cups of ketchup. We need some brown sugar. We're going to be using, the recipe calls for kosher salt. I'm going to be using seasoned salt. It's not going to make a huge difference here. Typically in canning, we use canning salt or a pure salt. I feel okay using the seasoned salt because it's not going to make my liquid cloudy or do anything weird looking in my jar. So I am fine with using the seasoned salt, plus it's going to add some extra seasonings to the barbecue sauce. So that's the one change I'm going to make. Then it also calls for garlic powder and onion powder. For the onion powder, I am going to be using dried minced onion, and this is a safe change to make. I always use the dried minced onion in my barbecue sauce, so that is the reason I'm going to change that up. If you prefer, you can go ahead and use the onion powder. The one thing that I do want to caution you on, do not be tempted to use fresh garlic or fresh onions in this recipe. This recipe was tested with the dried version, and it is a water bath canning recipe, and it's not safe to add low acid foods, which onion and garlic are both low acid foods. It's not safe to add low acid foods when you are water bath canning. You want to make sure you're using a tested recipe. That's why I stress all the time when we make salsas and things like that where we are using low acid foods in a water bath canning recipe that you stick strictly to the amounts. So this recipe does not allow for fresh garlic or fresh onion, so please do not think you can make that change. I'm only using the dried onion because it's still dried. So I'm safe making that change. I just like the flecks of onion in my barbecue sauce. So that is one change I'm making, and I know it's safe to do that. We need dried mustard, black pepper, paprika, ground red pepper, chili powder, and then the ketchup, of course. This recipe calls for 2 cups of water. This is another tweak that I am making. I am going to be using 1.5 cups of bourbon and 1/2 cup of water instead of the 2 cups of water. So if you don't want to make it bourbon barbecue sauce, that's fine. You can totally use the water here. But I'm going to use, like I said, 1.5 cups of bourbon and 1/2 cup of water instead of the 2 cups of water. You could substitute up to 2 cups of bourbon. That's probably a lot in this recipe, but you could also adjust that. As long as you're sticking to the 2 cups of liquid, you're fine. You could do half and half water, half bourbon. It's up to you, depending on how much you want. I find the 1.5 cups of bourbon is great for me. We're going to be using apple cider vinegar. It also calls for apple cider, 3/4 cup of apple cider. I did use the boiled cider that we made last, I guess it's been 2 years that I made that, but I made another version of it last year for you guys. That's why the boiled cider is really nice to have on hand, because you can reconstitute it, turn it into apple cider. And in this case, I'm going to use it in this recipe. So you can use fresh apple cider, or you can reconstitute your boiled cider. This recipe also calls for honey. I'm going to be using molasses instead. It's safe to swap those 2 out. We need some Worcestershire sauce, some bottled lemon juice. Make sure you're using bottled here, not fresh. And then they're calling for a tablespoon of their fiery fermented hot sauce, which is another fermented recipe that's in this book. I don't have that on hand, so I'm going to be using some sriracha instead, but that's also a safe change. So those are my changes. This is really simple, you guys. You just put it in the pot. We're going to bring it up to a simmer, bring it to a boil, reduce the heat, and simmer uncovered for approximately 20 minutes. They state until sauce is slightly thickened, and you want to make sure you're stirring it often. So it's drop and go. So we're going to get everything going in our pot, and while it is simmering, I'm going to get my jars and my canner ready. So I'm going to bring you in close, and we're going to get started. Okay, to my pot, I have 8 cups of ketchup. To that, we are going to add 2.5 cups of firmly packed brown sugar. We are going to add 1.25 cups of our apple cider vinegar, 3/4 cup of apple cider. I'm adding 6 tablespoons of my dried minced onion. And now we're gonna start adding our spices. We need 3 tablespoons of salt. Like I said, the recipe calls for kosher salt. I'm using seasoned salt here. So we need 3 tablespoons. 3 tablespoons of garlic powder. I'm adding a tablespoon of freshly ground black pepper. The recipe called for 2 teaspoons of pepper. I really like pepper in my barbecue sauce, so I'm adding more. That is safe to do. You can safely adjust dried spices. We need 3 tablespoons of ground mustard. We want 2 tablespoons of paprika. I'm using smoked paprika. I love smoky flavors in my barbecue sauce. The recipe calls for 1/2 teaspoon of chili powder. That seems like an insignificant amount, so I'm going to use 1 teaspoon, but you can adjust however you prefer. And then we need a teaspoon of cayenne pepper. If you do not groove on a lot of heat, you can skip this. But we're going to have a nice, sweet, smoky barbecue sauce here. Then we need 1/3 cup of molasses or honey. I'm using molasses, and I'm just going to eyeball it. We need 2 tablespoons of bottled lemon juice. We need 1/4 cup of Dijon mustard, prepared Dijon mustard, or they do state you can also use Creole. The truth is you can use whatever type of prepared mustard you like here. You could use regular yellow mustard, would be fine as well. The Dijon is just going to add a little nice something extra in the background. We need 2.5 tablespoons of Worcestershire. I'm just going to eyeball it. And then 1 tablespoon of sriracha. They called for the fiery fermented hot sauce. I'm just going to use sriracha. So we need about 1 tablespoon of that. You can use more or less of that. That's really just for flavor and heat. Then the other thing that I'm going to add that is not in the recipe is liquid smoke. I love a smoky barbecue sauce. So I'm going to add 2 tablespoons. You can omit it if you prefer. And then last but not least, I'm going to be adding 1.5 cups of my bourbon, and just as an FYI, I'm using Maker's Mark. That's one of my favorites. You can use any bourbon that you prefer. And then we just need a half of a cup of water to equal the 2 cups of water that was called for in the original recipe. So I'm going to turn this on high. We're going to give this a nice mix, get everything combined, and then we're going to bring it up to a boil, reduce to a simmer, and simmer for 20 minutes. As I stated before, make sure that you are stirring frequently so that nothing scorches or burns on the bottom. Okay guys, we got a nice simmer going on here. Like I said before, make sure that you are stirring it frequently. You don't want it to burn or scorch, and it will. It's got a lot of sugar in it, so it will tend to burn if you don't keep an eye on it. So just make sure you keep an eye on it. We're gonna let it simmer for about 20 minutes. I also recommend for you to taste it. Make sure you don't want to adjust any of your seasonings or your spices. You could also add a little more liquid smoke if you'd like. So that's up to you. So just make sure you give it a really nice taste. We're going to let it simmer for 20 minutes and then we are all set for canning. Okay guys, we are all set for canning. I simmered my barbecue sauce for 20 minutes. You want to just let it simmer long enough that it starts to thicken a little bit. It's still going to seem fairly runny, but it will thicken upon standing. So I would just go with 20 to 25 minutes or so. It's not going to be super thick. Before we get started canning, I want to mention a couple of things because I know not all of you stick around till the end, and shame on you, I wish you would. But anyway, if you do not know, I do have a Facebook group for canning called Canning with Carol and Friends. We would love to have you join us if you are not over there. Lots of sweet, kind, loving, caring people over there sharing questions and encouraging one another, and it's a great place to hang out. So we would love to have you, so check us out. The other thing I wanted to mention is if you are looking for a nice canning journal, I found this one on Amazon, and it's the one that I'm going to be using this year. In my opinion, it's just a nice journal. It's got a place for you to write down your recipes, date them, note the changes that you're making, and if you like the recipe or not, what your results were. It also allows you to add a table of contents, and then in the front it has where you can put the dates to and from. So it's not just for 1 year. You can customize it to however long you want to use it. So anyway, this is great. I will have it linked for you in the description box below. So canning. You can water bath can this or you can steam can this. You guys know, if you've hung around my channel very much, that I absolutely love steam canning. I'm going to be using my multi-use Victorio steam canner. It's now the Roots and Branches steam canner. So I'm going to be steam canning. If you are water bath canning, that's fine. You just want to make sure you have enough water in your canner that it will cover your jars by at least an inch once they are submerged. So I have 3 quarts of simmering water in the bottom of my canner. And do what you need to do if you're water bath canning. If you're not using this canner, make sure you follow whatever instructions come with your canner as far as that is concerned. My rack is also in there. I have washed my jars and I'm keeping them hot in a sink full of hot water. Modern canning guidelines state that we do not need to pre-sterilize our jars and lids if we're canning for 10 minutes or more, and our processing time for the barbecue sauce is going to be 15 minutes. I washed my lids and just set them aside. No need to simmer them, and as a matter of fact, if you're using the ball lids and you do simmer them, they will not seal very well. So don't simmer them, just wash them and set them aside. So we are ready to get started. The instructions for this recipe are canning in pints. So you could can in pints, you could can in half pints. You cannot can this in quarts. I don't have any instructions for canning in quarts, which I'm not sure why you would want barbecue sauce in quarts, but just to get that out of the way, I always get that question. And we are looking for 1/2 inch of headspace. So I'm gonna bring you in and we're gonna start canning. Okay, we're all set. I'm gonna start with 2 hot jars, and like I said, we want to ladle our sauce to 1/2 inch of headspace. Okay, once you get your jars filled, you're gonna use a debubbling tool, plastic butter knife, or a chopstick to release the air bubbles. So just poke around your jar a little bit, release any air bubbles that might be in there. Oftentimes after you release your air bubbles, your headspace will change. So if you need to, you can top off your jar to be at your 1/2 inch headspace. Then take a paper towel or a clean dishcloth. I dip mine in white vinegar. We're going to clean the rims. We don't want anything to interfere with a good seal. Then center your lid. Then add your ring to fingertip tight. And put them in your canner. Okay guys, I got 7 pints of barbecue sauce in my canner, so we're going to go ahead and put the lid on. We are going to crank up our heat. It's important that you turn your heat up to high. We want to get it going as soon as possible. If you are water bath canning, you want to make sure that your water, like I said, your water covers your jars by at least an inch. 1 to 2 inches is perfect. And you want to bring your water to a full boil before you start your processing time. For those of you who are steam canning, we want to see about a 6-inch steady stream of steam coming out of our steam vents, and then we're ready for timing. My canner has a gauge on top that tells me when to start timing. You want to make sure you're in the green zone if you have this gauge. So when we get there, I'll bring you back and we're going to process for 15 minutes. Okay guys, we're ready to start timing. I have a nice steady stream of steam about 6 inches long coming out of my steam vents, and my gauge is in my green zone. So I'm ready to start timing. We're going to process for 15 minutes. If you are water bath canning, you are at a full boil. Now what we need to do, we do not want it boiling this vigorously throughout the canning process. So we need to slowly reduce our heat to just maintain the full boil, or to just stay inside of your green zone on your steam canner if you have the gauge. So adjust your heat. Make sure you adjust your time for altitude. I'm canning for less than 1,000 feet. So make those adjustments as well. Process for 15 minutes and then I'll bring you back. Okay guys, we are all done. Once my processing time was up, I turned my heat off, removed my lid, and let my jar sit for 5 minutes. And that's where we are right now. So let's take a look at our barbecue sauce. Most of them have already sealed. And there you go. Delicious bourbon barbecue sauce. A little bit spicy, a little bit sweet, a little bit smoky, and a little bit of delicious bourbon in the background. It is so perfect and my absolute favorite. So for those of you who've been waiting for a safe canning recipe for the regular barbecue sauce that I have on my channel, there you go. I hope that you will give it a try. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them for me in the comment section. That's just Manny and Monty saying hi. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and I will see you next time. Have a great day, guys.